Welcome to Secrets to a Successful Migration. I'll be your host for the next 40 minutes or so, unless I talk faster, which I tend to do. I'm Brad Blake. I'm a software architect, and I work for Phase 2. And there's a shameless plug for our website. And there's my email in case you have any questions after this that you don't get a chance to ask. Feel free to ping me. So first thing I was going to ask, are there any My Little Pony fans out there? Yes. All right. But nobody's willing to be a brony or admit to it. All right. So migrations should be fun. Like, not necessarily maybe Pinkie Pie fun, but you should have an opportunity to learn new things. You're not solving the same problem over and over and over again. Like, a lot of times when I see people get assigned to do content migrations, data migrations, it's kind of like, oh no, not again, and like hot potato, right? But you should look at this optimistically. Like, it's a chance to expand your skill set, have some fun, and party. So when I talk about content migration or data migration, what am I talking about? I can be talking about a one-time migration of site content. So we're talking about like WordPress to Drupal, Drupal 6 to D7, D7 to D8, or just a CMS change in general. Like maybe you're going from flat files, some people still do use them as their CMS, to Drupal. Or it could be a periodic sync from an external data source. So that's like ingesting RS feeds into your site, doing live event scoring, streaming events and displaying that, or calendar data. Maybe you're getting events from an external system and you're pulling them in on cron or something like that. So I'm mostly going to talk about like a one-time data migration, but the same principles apply regardless. The realities of how I often see it done is it's the last thing to be done. So, when we talk about data migration, like we always finish the site first and then worry about how to migrate the data. But that's got a lot of problems. So that introduces schedule risk and makes things feel rushed. So then you've got a greater likelihood of, finding bugs late on, finding problems late on. And as I'll talk about, it's better to do that early rather than late. Come on in, there's seats, It's often not well documented, or it's not documented enough. So we might document like how to run the migration, but we don't document the things that really matter to our clients or our customers, which is like what maps to what, what's getting migrated, what isn't getting migrated. So we should be documenting it, and it shouldn't be a secret. Like it should be okay giving it to the marketing department, giving it to your client. It shouldn't be something that's just developer only. Often a developer does the testing. I shouldn't have to say how bad of an idea that is. But usually it's kind of like, well, the developer wrote it, so he can do the testing too. And that's just not a good idea. Data migrations also tend to uncover performance issues or bugs. So you're getting in real data, and it's usually messy, and there's a lot of it. So again, with number one, if you do it as the last thing right before you give it to your customer, you're going to have problems. The other reality is it's not going to go perfect. The schedule will be ruined by someone. There could be a time-consuming back and forth to get data and access. I've gone through where it's taken several weeks to contact a vendor and try to get a SQL export from SQL Server. They gave us a CSV. It wasn't valid. They couldn't give us a valid CSV because they couldn't figure it out, which is funny because they host SQL Server. So they ended up giving us a dump of the database. We spun it up on AWS, and we exported the CSV ourselves. But that took like 2 weeks of calendar time to get it done. I just got access to a database the other day. It's got 5 million nodes in it. That's a pretty big database. Trying to get a dump of it without filling up the file system is something that, you don't think about when you're going into it, right? So that's going to take some extra time too. The data will be bad. I'll talk about that later, but you're going to get messy data. You're going to find new fields. You're going to look at some column in the old data, and you're going to say, what's this for? And you're probably going to get a lot of head shaking, like, I don't know, right? So this is a good opportunity to find new fields. Encoding issues, you're going to run into them. Like your output might be UTF-16, you might be converting the UTF-8, or various other formats. Maybe it's Windows. All of my migrations, I have cleanup scripts that look in all the text and convert smart quotes from Windows to actual UTF-8 characters. And you're going to run into environment issues like out of memory, out of disk space. I can't count the number of times I've migrated into Drupal and I'm migrating images over and I fill up the disk. Or you could crash the server, done that too. So are there any referees, coaches, anything like that out there? Sports fans? You're a coach or a ref? All right, then don't take offense to this. But I'm a soccer ref, right? And so like I can totally get what's happening to this guy. Like he's got everybody screaming at him. And as a referee, I have the liberty of being able to ignore the coach or the player. Or I can, toss them out of the game or something. It's not the best strategy. Dialogue is best, right? But I can, like I have the upper hand. When I'm doing a data migration for a client or a customer, and when I say customer, that could be like literally the marketing department, the news department, or an external client. Like I don't have the same ability. Like they have the upper hand. So I don't want to get into the situation where I've got people screaming at me about how they can't find their content or it's broken or something like that. When you have a bad migration experience, you tend to lose trust with the client and it turns into a giant time suck. It's going to be a major fire drill. You're going to have meetings upon meetings upon meetings and then wonder when you can actually get the work done. So you don't want to be this guy. So some tips, start the process early. That can be challenging sometimes to fit into the dev schedule when you've got somebody that wants like all these features done first, but it reduces a major source of risk. So it's worth fighting that battle of like, okay, I'm creating an event node and event pages and lists and all these things. Like as part of that, I should be migrating the events so that when you get to the end, everything is done. You just have to tweak, run, or whatever, and 90% or more is done. When you start the process early, you also give developers and testers real data, and that is invaluable because whenever somebody makes up fake data, they always make it up so it doesn't break things. That's just the reality of it. So when you get real data, you expose those bugs. And it also gives customers a real sense of movement. I've gotten standing ovations before at the beginning of projects from clients that saw their data in the new system. It wasn't themed. Right? It didn't really look great, but we could open up admin content and show them all their data, and they actually got up and gave us an ovation. Like, so that's great for customers to see. Also, document the heck out of everything, so you can give it to the client. So there's no confusion over what got migrated to where, and if you happen to come out in the middle of the migration, somebody else comes on, they can pick it right up. Test, and test. Find the edge cases. Like in a lot of systems, when you ask somebody, are there any pages that are like different than everything else? They'll often be like, well, yeah, on this one page, like I have to click save 4 times and do this and this and this to make it work right. Like you're going to want to test that one after you migrate it. You also might have to do that one manually. And spot check. Distinct and count are your friends when you're trying to get reports to give to the client. Like, okay, well, you had 500 photo galleries in the new system. I can show you that 500 got moved over. And run full tests. I had a developer I won't name on a recent migration, and I was doing a code review, and I saw that there was code limiting it to the first 25 items. Like, that's bad on a number of levels that it got committed in the first place. But like, if you haven't run a full test, how do you know that that last node doesn't have some weird like Cyrillic characters that are going to break everything? Or you're not going to run out of memory, or the migration won't take like 8 hours to run. So you're not going to know these things unless you've run the full tests. And expect the unexpected, like things will change, especially if there might be an external system that may or may not get shut off. Like I've had customers before be like, well, this one-time migration, can you actually cron it every 10 minutes? So that changes things, but you know, what can you do, right? The biggest one might be to communicate and be proactive. If you have, say, 10 nodes that don't migrate, don't let the customer find them, because then you're going to be that guy I showed before. Give them a list of, hey, these 10 nodes with links didn't migrate because, you know, it might be that captions are a required field now and it didn't used to be before. They don't have captions. You know, and then give them options like, hey, you can go and add captions to your new system. We cannot migrate them, or we can make caption not required, right? So now you have the upper hand. You're letting them know you're going to have a dialogue as opposed to you getting yelled at. Provide reports. You know, at the end of the migration, you're going to want to document like, hey, you know, these are the different content types that got migrated. Here's how many there are. So that you can compare and make the customer feel happy. Also, don't assume, ask. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but ask before you do any work. Don't assume what you're going to migrate. And then it's a good chance to brush up on your SQL. I had another unnamed developer tell me that they haven't written a SQL statement in years because of views, entity field query, and all this stuff, right? And as a Drupal developer, like I can totally see that, but if the customer says like, hey, how many images does the largest migrated gallery have? Because we want to check the UI on the back end and make sure that like if it has 100 images, it's not going to totally bomb out, right? So like if you can't construct a query that's got basic things like, you know, a group by and things like that, you're going to be out of luck trying to set up a view to get it, or, you know, just like do some spot checking. You don't want to have to do that. Or, you know, are there any image galleries with one image? Because we don't want to migrate them. Or, well, this field used to be like a varchar 255 in the old system, and now it's a varchar 100. Is that going to break everything? So like, what's the max length of the values in this field in the old system? So there's a lot of things that you can figure out. The one in my notes, of course, is like, how many events have different start and end dates? Like, if we don't have an end date field now, does that really matter if they don't have start and end dates in the current system? And if every event has a start and an end date and they're all different, well, then, you know, you got problems. You're probably going to have to add an end date to the new system. So what does the process look like for a migration? The key thing I'm going to mention is, again, don't assume. Like sometimes, like Back to the Future, you might get it right. And the Cubs might win the World Series in 2015. But more often than not, you're going to be wrong. So when you talk about what's getting migrated, make sure you ask before you do any of the work. Like maybe they don't want the users to migrate to the new system. They want to start fresh. Maybe they're going to have new taxonomies, like maybe they want everything in the files directory, but hopefully they don't. But it's a good thing to ask. Also, you know, as I mentioned before, find out where the content is stored and get access. That should be the first thing you do. Like when you're starting the project, that should be the first thing you're doing. Does the client care about revision history? Some people, especially government clients, do care about revision history. So then you have to make it so that you carry that over. Workflow state, if you're using Workbench or something like that, you're going to want to make sure you set the appropriate state. Mapping. So then, you know, it's a time to map the content types and the fields. Maybe everything used to be a free text field and you're converting it to actual, like, you know, small ints and things that make sense. I've seen 170 text fields in a table before. It's not pretty. So this is a chance to actually convert it to same things and then figure out what the defaults should be on all your new fields. It's a chance to create your new forgotten fields. And again, like document. It shouldn't be a secret. That's my one transition, I guess, that I put in there. Do a gap analysis, and I was playing around with Google presentations, and I think I forgot to take it out. Edit the content in the current CMS and compare the fields and the field types, and then view the content in the old CMS and look for what displays, but more importantly, like what never displays in the old system. Because you can make a case you don't even need to migrate that over, right? And that's probably going to save overhead, save some time. So now that we've done a lot of our homework, what tool are we going to use? So we need to figure out what format is the source data in and how much work is it going to get into something that we need. How often does it need to run? Is it like a one-time deal? Do we need to run updates on cron? You know, if it runs every 10 minutes, you have a lot different considerations for performance than if it runs once. Is it complex? You know, if you have field collections nested 5 times over, you probably want to take that into account when choosing your tool. You know, maybe you want to write custom scripts or something to handle that. Migrate does not handle that well. And how performant does it need to be? That's sort of along with number 2. Like, you don't want to prematurely optimize, but you want to figure out, like, can I run this over the weekend? Is it going to take 2 weeks? Does it need to run in an hour? That kind of thing. So I mentioned migrate. There's a lot of talk in Drupal about, as far as D7 goes, like migrate is the Drupal way, so we have to use it. Don't listen to that. Like, it's like buying a car. I want a Lamborghini, but when I do my research and I figure out how much it costs and the miles per gallon and all that, like, that's really not what I need. So this might be what I need. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly good car, but that's what I need instead of a Lamborghini. So you've got a bunch of different tools. This is for D7. D8 has migrate sort of baked in, though at last check the UI was not finished. But in D7 at least, you had the migrate suite of modules. WordPress migrate especially works great for migrating from WordPress sites. You've got feeds and feeds XPath parser. I said that right. I usually mungle it. But that's great because it'll allow you to take any XML and use XPath and do your mappings there. So you don't have to like rely on it being a standard RSS or anything format. Custom drush commands are good, but make sure you use the batch API so that you don't error out. And manual entry is often forgotten, but it's a perfectly valid way to do data migration. You sort of have to weigh, like, if you have 5 nodes, you probably want to do that by hand. And there's a trade-off of, like, how many nodes can I reasonably do in a certain amount of time versus how long is it going to take me to write this script. You know, and if it's going to take you less time to do manual entry, like, that is certainly an option. It doesn't have to be one thing either. It can be a combination or all of the above. It depends on what content it is, what the content type looks like. Maybe taxonomies are handled a little differently. So manipulate your data. So when you get the data, get it into the right format. Like I said, SQL Server requires finesse, and that's a nice way to put it, to export valid CSV. WordPress gives you a nice WXR file. If you can get XML, that's great. If it's really, really ugly and you can't do anything with it, and I've seen this in some legacy systems where the names in the XML are literally like field 1, field 2, field 3, and you can't make heads or tails of it. And one I did had like 10 different GUIDs in the file. Like, what GUID, anyway. See if the customer can give you a better data feed. Like, maybe they can create you a view if they're using Drupal. Maybe they can write a feed or like a custom script or something that'll give you something usable and save you a lot of time rather than you having to figure out their data format. Another thing I've found helpful is if I have static content like flat HTML, parse it into a normalized database first. That way you can run queries against it and figure out how much data you have, what the data looks like, what the distinct values look like, and that kind of thing. And then you can take it from your database, which could be like one table or a set of tables, into the Drupal nodes. So that's usually very helpful. Examine the data. Like this is, again, don't assume the data is clean. On a recent project, I actually had these values. So the body field, when it didn't have a body, would have 0, the word none, an empty string, or null. And that all meant no body. And so we migrated some things, and we were like, why does it say none in the body? That's not right. The title could have entities or not. Boolean can have all manner of values. These are some things where you're going to want to use distinct and figure out if the data is clean or not. Find the edge cases like I mentioned before, because you'll definitely want to test those. And this is my Jeff Foxworthy portion of the talk. Look for data integrity issues. If you have a state column and 62 values in it that are distinct, you might have a problem. If you have what's supposed to be a Boolean with more than 2 values, you might have a problem. So then you might have to get some mappings and fixes into your scripts or get somebody to clean up the data first. So then you're going to do the work, right? And that's the fun stuff. You're going to write the code, implement the modules, perform the configuration, and do all that stuff. And you're going to test again. You're going to run the full tests and spot check. The more eyes, the better. It shouldn't just be the developer who did it. It should be other developers. You've got a project manager. If you've got somebody on the team who always breaks things and finds the broken things, get them on it, right? Get the client or customer on it too after you've done some initial validation. And gather your data. So how many items were migrated again? What items weren't migrated and why? Some things to consider when you're doing your tests. You might want to turn off non-essential modules that are going to have overhead, like purge and expire. There's no reason to purge varnish after saving a node if you're just running a test. That's just going to make the test take way longer. Don't use dblog, use syslog. That should be something you do anyway, but definitely during a test. Turn off cron, whether that be poor man's cron in D7 or actual cron. Make sure it's not running. You might want to put search in the read-only mode when you do a node save, so that Solar isn't getting purged if you're doing deletes or various things. And there are ways to disable certain hooks from running in Drupal. So you might want to do that if you're taking a long time to run the migration. Some gotchas I've seen, some of the ones I've seen lately that are pretty nasty. One is if you're migrating lots of images that are referenced on a third party like S3 or somewhere else, and you're just referencing them through media or wherever. Pre-generate your image styles, because what actually has to happen if you reference an S3 image, it'll actually go fetch the image, bring it down, then cut up the image styles whenever you get the request to make the image style. That's a lot of overhead, and it can make your page the first time load really, really slow. It's pretty easy to write scripts that'll pre-generate the image styles after you've done the migration, and then you don't have to worry about all of a sudden all these image styles are getting called and you've got all this network traffic and your site is really, really slow. Workbench is a gotcha in and of itself, but especially when you're doing a migration. Workbench really doesn't like having a node status of 1 and a state of draft. It will do bad things. So make sure you set the right state, whether that's before you save the node, or you can call Workbench moderation, moderate afterwards, and make it published if you need to. Relative image paths or links in the body, just make sure that those are accounted for. If there's links to files on the file system or images or whatever with relative paths, if you're not migrating the whole files directory, which I recommend you don't, you'll probably want to fetch these over. Even better for extra points is if you change the links to go to the new URLs. But hopefully you'll have 301s in place, so if you forget that step, it won't matter so much. And then styling of the old content. A lot of it will have legacy HTML in it. You can probably add a body class to the migrated content and then put in some styling to make it good enough. That'll buy you a lot of goodwill. It's probably not going to look perfect, but you can get it close. So since we didn't prematurely optimize, because that's bad, so now it's time to figure out, too, what's slow. So I've seen taxonomy term save really, really bogged down migrations when you have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of terms. So in that case, instead of that, maybe you want to write that as just a couple DB inserts. Too many indexes. Like, it's perfectly okay to remove indexes from your tables and then add them back in later. Because the more indexes you have, the longer your writes are going to be. So we can also write our cleanup routines, write some drush commands, make sure they're reusable in case you need to run them again and again and again for like partial migrations. These are things like changing the links in the body could be one, associating referenced content, in case you have one of those like images reference image galleries, but image galleries reference images. It's like, well, you might have to write a script later that'll actually associate them all together. Redirects should be top of mind from the very beginning. It shouldn't be a last-minute scramble trying to figure out how I'm going to generate all these 301s. So you can generate them from migrate, not easily, but with a couple dozen lines of code, you can come up with a list of 301 redirects. And you're going to want to choose the right tool. The redirect module often gets suggested, but that has a lot of overhead. So if you can avoid using that, that's great, unless your client wants to edit redirects in the UI. I hope you can discourage them from doing so. htaccess, if you're on a hosting provider, you don't have access to the vhost or anything like that, you'll probably need to put them in the htaccess file. Less overhead, but still more than putting them in the vhost itself if you have access to it. Or put them on the edge, like at Akamai or somewhere like that, and you get even better performance. So prepare to migrate. I've done everything else. I've done all my testing. Everything's good to go. I'm going to turn off all my non-essential tasks, like cron or whatever else that I mentioned before. Ensure that I have plenty of disk space, especially if I'm migrating images. I've gone through it before where I was migrating and it took a whole weekend, and on Sunday I ran out of disk space. And I had to call up the client and get them to extend the disk, and then later that day extend the disk again, right? So it's not pleasant when you're on the phone for like 4 hours on a Sunday for anybody. So make sure you've got plenty to begin with. Send notice, like tell the client or the customer, your whole team, you're going to be doing the migration so they stay off the system and you're not getting complaints of like, well, the system's slow. Well, yeah, the system's slow. Like I'm doing like 100,000 node saves. It's going to be slow. If you've got CI tools like Jenkins, disable them. You do not want Jenkins to do a build when you're in the middle of a migration. Arrange for support. That's sort of like what I mentioned later. Like if you're going to migrate over the weekend because you don't want to affect people actually being on the system doing content entry, make sure there is somebody available that you can call in case you crash the server or something like that. And take backups so you have a good pre-migration state. Run the migration. And unfortunately, this tint is, you can't really see the minion as well, but you should be happy. Everything's going great. Post-migration, disable all your migration modules. You don't want them having extra overhead in Drupal. Re-enable anything you disabled. Gather your data so you can send a nicely formatted report to the client or customer. And send your success and all clear notices that everything's good. You can get back on the system. And that is it. Like I said, I do talk fast. when I'm actually up here. So does anyone have any questions? All right, if not,
Usually how long the migration will take? Depends on the size?
Yeah, so the question was, how long does the migration take? And it really depends on the size and how you choose to do it. If you're doing node save, that has a lot more overhead than if you just decide to do some manual inserts. But in general, things start to slow down the more nodes are in the system, right? So like it might fly for the first like 5,000 nodes and then start slowing and then slowing, and then you get to like 100,000 and it's like, so migrations of like, 100 or thousands of nodes usually go pretty quick. I mean, I ran some Thursday morning where, I was importing like 500 nodes at a time, and it would take like, a couple minutes. So that can be pretty quick. It's when you really get into the really large data sets and you get into the really complex things where you've got like nested field collections, and you're doing a lot of entity save, that it can take a long time.
So what kind of data, how big the data you have handled, in terms of migration?
How big in terms of migration, like have I handled? Like I'm doing one now that's got 5 million nodes. So it can be, I mean, it depends. Like,
so what things you keep in mind if you have to handle a huge amount of data? What strategy or approach you have to take?
When I'm handling the large amounts of data, I tend to avoid some of the Drupal functions. Like I mentioned, like taxonomy term save slows down a lot, rather than you can do like 2 inserts into the database, and that'll go in like milliseconds. And taxonomy term save could take like 3 seconds when you have a lot of terms. So that's something I look at. Also, like inserting users and things like that. I tend to try to use direct inserts when possible. It's not necessarily the Drupal way, but it's the fast way. I tend to avoid migrate too, because migrate is slow, and write my own custom scripts for large amounts of data.
Okay, so during the process of migration, if some records get miss out, how do you ensure that those records are again?
So the question is, if something gets skipped or doesn't migrate properly during the migration, like how do I know about it and how do I make sure it gets migrated? Log. You can log to watchdog anything that gets, or syslog anything that gets skipped. Or you can have like a custom log file if you have a lot of noise in syslog and you want to isolate it, just write to a separate log file. And that way it's pretty easy to find. I'll tend to like have 2 windows open, one running the migration and one tailing the syslog, so that I can see like if things are getting skipped. Yeah, that's where like generally I will try to figure out why they got skipped or errored out. I mean, it could be bad characters a lot of the time. It could be some of the fields are too long, like you're trying to insert 200 bytes into a 100 byte field. Let's see, it could be that some required fields aren't filled out, and so it doesn't save. So like the answer is to figure out why and then fix it and run it again. Thank you.